Hello, it's Sunday evening, that is, here on the East Coast of the United States. I'm doing a video tonight on my channel here, Discerning What is True. I'm actually on Facebook with this channel, and I'm also YouTube and also um, Odyssey. If you'd like to watch those videos in those particular venues, you're welcome. The book I'm going to be reading from tonight is what I would call a very important book for us to understand, called Propaganda. This book was written by Edward Bernays. It was written in 1928. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is going to be reading from it. Basically, going to be the introduction, and we'll see how that goes. And from then on, we'll see if it's going to be how long it's going to be and all that type of thing. But I'm glad you guys are here, and I hope you enjoy it. This is a classic. Kind of basically has changed the whole 20th century. In the past, this book is almost 100 years old. It's 95 years old. This book was published in 1928. So here we go. Thank you for being here again. Prior to World War I, the word propaganda was little used in English except by certain social activists and close observers of the Vatican. And back then, propaganda tended not to be the damning term we thought we throw out today. The word has been coined in 1622 when Pope Gregory XV, frightened by the global spread of Protestantism, urgently proposed an addition to the Roman Curia, the Office for Propagation of the Faith, which supervise the Church's missionary efforts in the New World and elsewhere. They are to take account of and to deal with each and every concern for the spread of the faith throughout the world. Far from denoting lies, half-truths, selective history, or any of the other tricks that we associate with propaganda now, that word meant at first the total opposite of such deception, of the sheep now wretchedly straying the world over, Gregory wrote. Especially if it is to be desired that, inspired by divine grace, they should cease to wander amidst heresies through the unhappy pastures of infidelity, drinking deadly and poisonous water, but be placed in the pasture of the true faith, that they may be gathered together in saving doctrine, and be led to the springs of the water of life. The word seemed to have retained its strongly Catholic aura well into the 19th century, and often, when the user stressed that Roman origin, the word would be prejudicate, that is derived from the celebrated society, the Congregation Deo Propaganda. The name propaganda applies in modern political language as a term of reproach to secret associations for the spread of opinions, principles which are viewed by most governments with horror and aversion, writes the British chemist William Thompson Brand in 1842. However, while the word then could be used to make a sinister impression, it did not automatically evoke subversive falsehood, as it has since the 1920s. In his English Traits, 1856, for instance, Emerson used propagandists as an adjective, not as a suggestive of the stealthy spread of some pernicious creed or notion. He described the British as still aggressively and propagandist, enlarging the dominion of their arts and he said liberty, a passage that associates propaganda not with alien subversions, but the most enlightened rule. Their laws are hospitable, and slavery does not exist under them. What oppression exists is incidental and temporary. Their success is not sudden or fortunate, but they have maintained constant and self-equality for many ages. Prior to the war, the word's derogative use was far less common than neutral denotations. Hence, for example, is the calm and accurate definition given in the Oxford English Dictionary: an association, systematic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation of a particular doctrine or practice. So you see it's coming from a religious perspective here. Thus used propaganda generally perceived not as an instrument for striking horror and aversion in the souls of government officials, but as an enterprise whose consequences might seem horrid or inconspicuous or even beneficial, depending on its authors and their aim as the perceived point of view. A campaign to improve public health through vaccinations, sanitary cooking, or the placement of spittoons was as or is no less a propaganda drive than any anti-cleric or socialist or nativist crusade. Evidently, this fact was apparently to those few who used the word, which did not become a synonym for big black lies until the Allies made the word familiar to the masses of Great Britain and America. Other then, propaganda was a term so unimportant that there is no definition for it in the great 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, which does not include a short entry for propagate, which does include a short entry for propagate. The war had a complex effort on the repute of propaganda, although the practice had, albeit unnamed, been variously used by governments for centuries. Napoleon was especially incisive on the subject as well as an inspired practitioner. It was not until 1915 that government first systematically deployed the entire range of modern media to rouse their population's fanatic accent. Here was an extraordinary state accomplishment, mass enthusiasm at the prospect of global brawl that otherwise would mystify those very masses, and that shattered most of those who actually took part in it. The Anglo-American drive to denounce or demonize the Hun, that's what they call the Germans, the Hun, Hun, and to cast the war as a transcendental clash between Atlantic civilization and Prussian barbarism, made so powerful an impression on so many that the world of government and business were forever changed. Now public opinion stood out as a force that must be managed, and not through clever guesswork, but by experts trained to do that all-important job. Thus, the war improved the status of those working in the fields of public persuasion. Formerly, the lords of industry and commerce had often seen the advertising agent as a charlatan, associated with the tawdry buncombe used to peddle patent medicines and cigarettes, and trying to sell a service that any boss with half a brain could surely manage on his own. The field of public relations also had been esteemed by those atop the social pyramid who saw that such sort of work as necessary only to the vaudeville circuit and on Broadway. The Great Allied campaign to celebrate or sell democracy, etc. See, this was not the thinking in the past. This used to be the word democracy was not hardly used. Also, so republic would have been used. But this is how they're steering, begin to use propaganda is to steer people, etc. Was a venture so successful and it seemed so noble that it suddenly legitimized such propagandists who, once the war had ended, went right to work masking or inciting various publics on behalf of entities like General Motors, Procter & Gamble, John D. Rockefeller, and General Electric. And so from the signing of the Versailles Treaty to the crash of 1929, there were high excitements in the booming field of peace-time propaganda. That reborn generation of admin and publicists, no longer common hucksters but professionals, sold their talents to big business through a large barrage of books, essays, speeches, and events, extolling the miraculous efforts of advertising and or publishing, that is, of propaganda as the proponents of the craft, and their corporate clients often kept referring to it quietly, that is. According to the propagandist evangelical salesmanship, many of them were in fact the sons of ministers. Their revolutionary science would do far more than make some people richer, just as during the war, propaganda would at once exalt the nation and advance the civilizing process, teaching immigrants and other folks of modest means how to transform themselves through smart consumption into happy and presentable Americans. Remember, the Tavistock is I think 1911 or 1912, maybe 1910. This is the beginning of Tavistock in Britain. So throughout the 20s, as propaganda, earnest advocates devoutly pushed their false FAUX progressiveness line, propaganda seemed, at least to those who peddled in it, a wondrous new progressive force capable of brightening every life and every home. That quasi-religious pitch was memorial made in books like Ernest Elmo, Business the Civilizer, Bruce Barton, best-selling parable The Man Nobody Knows, 1925, and less distinctively, and countless other works of what we might call propaganda. Like its wartime prototype, the post-war propaganda drive was an immense success that it persuaded not just businessmen, but journalists, and politicians then that the manufacture of consent, I should say, in Walter Lippmann's famous phrase, was necessary throughout the public sphere. His phrase was simply the manufacture of consent. And yet, for all his honking bouchard, that sales campaign was oddly hobbled from the start because the product very name and came into the news and into common conversation as a dirty word. Ironically, the same Great War drive that had made the alien term propaganda commonplace had also made the neutral term perjuria, at the very moment of the propagandists' triumph as professionals, in other words, to be referred to as a propagandist was an insult. This was no accident, but a paradoxical result of the war propagandists' winning enterprise, for the propagandists had themselves besmirched the word by using it always and only in dark reference to the enemy. We did not call it propaganda, for that word in German hands had come to be associated with deceit and corruption, writes George Creel, Creel, director of the U.S. Office of War Information, and How We Advertise America in 1920. The Germans having trashed the word, Creel claims, the Americans never used it to refer to their own output, but rightly favored others' more exalted terms instead. Our effort was educational and informational throughout, for we had such confidence in our case as to feel that no other argument was needed than the simple, straightforward presentation of facts. That passage itself, of course, a stunning bit of propaganda, as it bluntly reconfirms the Manchurian plot that Creel and company had hammered home throughout the war. Germans always lie. Americans always tell the truth. How the German propaganda had come to be associated with deceit and corruption is a question Creel would rather not address, preferring instead to bury it in that sly, if sly it was, passive construction. There's much to say about Creel's obfuscation or evasion of the fact that his own propagandists had associated German propaganda with corruption and deceit, and did so just as Creel does in that passage. At this point, however, our main concern is not propaganda's crucial self-effacement, but the darkening effect of Allied propaganda on the elusive word itself. In World War I, it was the propaganda of our side that first made propaganda so appropriate a term foul by close association with the Hun. The word did not regain its innocence, not even when the Allies' propaganda used to tar the Hun had been belatedly exposed to the American and British people. Indeed, as they learned more and more about the outright lies, exaggerations, and half-truths used on them by their own governments, both populations came, understandably, to see propaganda as a weapon even more proficiently than they had thought when they had not perceived themselves as a real target. Thus did the word demonically implications only harden through the 20s in spite of certain random efforts to redeem it. So actually, it already began to take place as a negative term with what we call with American people. Second section here. Edward Bernays' propaganda, that is 1928, was the most ambitious of such efforts. Through meticulous description of a broad variety of post-war propaganda drives, all of them ingeniously, apparently benign in purpose and honest in their execution, Bernays attempts to rid the word of its bad smell. His motivation would appear to be twofold. Bernays always deemed himself to be both a truth seeker and a propagandist for propaganda, as he put it in another apology in 1929. On the one hand, then, his interest would be purely scientific, and so his efforts to redeem the word is based to some extent on intellectual necessity, there being no adequate substitute for propaganda. In this, Bernays was right and never quite gave up his preference for that word over all the euphemisms. His wish to reclaim the appropriate term bespeaks a serious commitment to precision. Bernays was not only to hype anything, not his clients' waves, and not his craft. Continue. In propaganda, as in all his writings, there is none of the utopian grandiose that marked so many of the decade's other pro-commercial homilies. Bernays' tone is managerial, not millennial, nor does he nor does he promise that his methodology will turn this world into a modern paradise. His vision seems quite modest. The word informed by public relations would be but a smoothly functioning society where all of us are guided imperceptibly throughout our lives by the benign elite of national manipulators. Bernays derived this vision from the writings of his intellectual hero, Walter Lippmann, whose classic Public Opinion appeared in 1922. So these are the two major people actually in Tavistock. So pretty important you to figure this out, begin to see this, as I've already shared from reading the Tavistock Institute that was shared by John Coleman. From his observation on the Allied propaganda drive's immense success and his own stint as a U.S. war propagandist, and from his readings of Gusto Lebrun, Graham Wallace, and John Dewey, among others, Lippmann had arrived at the bleak view that the democratic El Dorado is impossible in modern man societies whose members, by and large, are incapable of a lucid thought or clear perception, driven by herd instincts and mere prejudice, and frequently disoriented by external stimuli, were not equipped to make decisions or engage in rational discourse. So we're already making a judgment here. Democracy, therefore, requires a supra-governmental body of detached professionals to sift the data, think things through, and keep the national enterprise from blowing up or crashing to a halt. Although mankind surely can be taught to think that its educational process will be long and slow. In the meantime, the massive issues must be framed, the crucial choices made by the responsible administrator. It is on the men inside, working under conditions that are sound, that the daily administration of society must rest. So you see, they've taken this whole idea of, carrying the ball, so to speak, and going to, this is what we got to do because we got to make people aware. We got to keep this ball rolling, just keep the economy going, just keep all. You see, this is already happening. They're beginning to become the spokespeople for the country itself, and becoming more important than others, even as the president himself. While Lippmann's arguments is freighted with complexities and tingle with the melancholy of a delusional socialist, Bernays' adaptation of it is both simple and enthusiastic. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. These invisible governors are a heroic elite who coolly keep it all together, thereby organizing chaos. And God did it in the beginning. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind, and guide the world. While Lippmann is meticulous, indeed at times near Pocus, in demonstrating how and why most people have such trouble thinking straight, Bernays takes all that for granted as a fact. He's a sort of managerial aristocrat, that is, that quietly determines what we buy and how we vote and what we deem as good or bad. They govern us, the author writes, by their qualities of natural leadership, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key positions in the social structure. Although purportedly vaguely to be one of us, it soon becomes quite clear that Bernays sees himself as an exemplar of that elevated supervisor network, just as he sees his own profession as the most important one up there. Thus, Bernays proceeds as both a truth seeker and a propagandist for propaganda. While he did believe wholeheartedly in his hierarchy concept of democracy, and so went on believing through the many further decades of his life, as Stuart Ewan tells us, propaganda is primarily a sales pitch, not an exercise in social theory, in other words. While propaganda is by no means an exhaustive treatment of its subject, the book is edifying for its own propaganda tactics, and for the light it sheds obliquely on the hidden zeal with which most winning propagandists do their work, however scientifically and detached they may appear to be, even to themselves. Apparently, a cool defense of propaganda and its solitary influence on mass society, this book is extended and for public relations, as Bernays himself had learned to practice it with rare intelligence and skill. By 1928, he had become the leading figure in his ever-growing field. Not only had he managed to legitimate his craft, counsel on public relations, also was his pointed self-description, but his own shop was bustling. His services were therefore not available to everyone. Propaganda is aimed mainly at Bernays' potential corporate clientele. Yet the author various masks that plutocracy that is biased at the outset. His seductive use of us implies that he, like most of us, is just a fuddly propagandee and not himself the ablest of individual governors. In chapter 1, he further mystifies the status of his usual customers by casting propaganda as a sort of populist endeavor and not as an expensive game that is played best by those who have the most to spend on it. Bernays does this by compiling ostensibly inclusively list of what he represents as a common propaganda source, that is, catalogs primarily of modest civil and professional associations and publications. Such example is the ARION Singing Society or the National Nut News, with few, if any, blue chip outfits mentioned. And perhaps Bernays was also distinguishingly in filling out the volume with his late brief chapters on how propaganda can serve education, social service, art and science, little forays in social and cultural concern, intended seemingly to make the book deem something other than an essay on how business stands to benefit immeasurably from the author's sort of expertise. All such quasi-democratic touches, notwithstanding, propaganda mainly tells us that Bernays' true meta was to help giant players with their various sales and image problems. It's all for big business, you see. It's not for the little man. And that sort of effort he was in a class all by himself. The Ivy League was the only other PR man, Ivy League, L-E-E, was the only other PR man of comparable renown, and his accomplishments were nowhere near as many or as dazzling as the one described in propaganda, not to mention all the others that the author managed after 1928. The book is most instructive when it tells us how and why Bernays did what he did for his mostly corporate clients. There are many such revealing moments here. For every case of winning propaganda, citing this book was actually Bernays' own handiwork. The casual reader sees no egoism in such self-promotion, as Bernays discreetly slips into passive voice each time he tells us what was done or shown or proven, with extraordinary deftness. He has no equal as a propaganda strategist. Always thinking far ahead, his aim was not to urge the buyer to demand the product now, but to transform the buyer very world so that the product must appear to be desirable without the product of salesmanship. What is the prevailing custom, and how might that be changed to make this thing or that appear to recommend itself to people? The modern propagandist sets to work to create circumstances which will modify that custom. Bernays sold Mozart's pianos, for example, not just by hyping the pianos, rather he sought carefully to develop public acceptance of the idea of a music room in a home, selling the pianos indirectly through various suggestive trends and enterprise that made it a de rigueur to have the proper space for a piano in your house. In other words, he's basically, what I'm saying simply is to seeing is he's setting the mood, so to speak, and also setting what I would call something that looks, attractive is a selling point. The music room will be accepted because it has been made the thing, and the man or woman who has a music room or has arranged a corner of the parlor as a musical corner will naturally think of buying a piano. It will come to him as his own idea. Interesting. So very mystifying in some ways here too. Propaganda and Bernays himself throughout, this is section 3, Propaganda and Bernays himself throughout his long career sold something more than all the goods and services his clients offered, and also something more than propaganda is a necessary tool for businessmen and politicians. Bernays sold the myth of propaganda as a wholly rational endeavor, carrying out methodologically by carefully experts skilled enough to lead public opinion. Consistently, he cast himself as a supreme manipulator, mastering the response of a pliable, receptive population. Conscious and intelligent manipulator or manipulation, invisible governors, they who pull the wires which control the public mind, shrewd persons operating behind the scenes, dictators exercising great power, and below them people working as if in actuality by the touch of a button. These are but a few expressions of the icy scientific paradigm that evidently drove his propaganda practice and that colored all his thinking on the subject. The propagandist rules, you see. The propagandists do whatever he would have them to do, exactly as he tells them to, and without knowing it, you see. Derived from the positivism of the 19th century and indirectly voiced by the work of Bernays' uncle, Sigmund Freud. And see, these are all connected here, okay? This neo-Baconian conception of the propagandist power was surely not Bernays' invention. That cool and manly image was a commonplace from the 20th through the Cold War, as was the obverse image of the crowd as female in a feverish responsiveness. Why was this tableau of domination so pervasive? For self-conscious professionals such as Bernays, expert detachment was, of course, a point of pride. And as a strong selling point, as that hard attitude provided tactic reassurance to potential clients that the propagandists worked not just by instinct or mood, but impartially and, if need be, ruthless as any doctor or attorney. He could work others up without getting all worked up himself, or going native, as we would say, as said officials in the U.S. state, emphasizing with the foreign papas that he was sent to do. The myth of the detached manipulator and compliant crowd has, since the 20s, also been abundantly re-echoed by academy students of mass persuasion. Conviction is a demography. Our weakness and may prove a very serious injury, that is asserted by social psychologist Frederick C. Benn, B-E-N-N, in 1928. They are the last infirmity of some otherwise very splendid demagogue, I should say. It's similar to demagogue, but it's demagoguery. So it still is often with the intellectual studies of successful rabble rousers, analysts projecting his own rationality onto the firebrand in question as if assuring us that he is too intelligent and self-possessed to fall for that spellbinder who excites the vulgar herd. Indeed, the same myth of the unmoved mover has been amply reconfirmed by some of history's most effective agitators. Hitler liked to cast himself as a detached appraiser of his own frenzies at the podium, and Goebbels too believed himself to be completely cold inside, even as his orator thrilled the crowd. There's no way to confirm this notion that the propaganda this is essentially above the fray that he creates. While it surely points us towards some truths about the way that demagogues and other propagandists operate, the notion is unlikely on his face. From what we know about the most ferocious demagoguery of yesterday, successful mass incitement does tend to be speak, and seemingly requires a fiery cord of radical commitment, even if the agitator consciously distorts his facts or trots out this or that rhetoric vice. Hitler, Goebbels, Mussolini, Father Constantin, as Coughlin, Joe McCartney, and Gerald L.K. Smith, and many others were fanatic and cynical at once, neither wholly in control nor totally ecstatic. Such agitators work within a certain mental borderland where one can never clearly see conviction as distinct from calculation. Indeed, that inner murkiness appears itself to be the very source of basis in the mass manipulator enigma power. And so we cannot comprehend it through schematic dualistic formulas. Orwell's exclusive concept of doublethink is highly pertinent here. Of course, there are significant differences between such epoch-making dervishes as Hitler, Conklin, and McCarthy, who worked in person on a stage or at a microphone, and propagandists not intend arousing furious reactions on the spot. Behind even the wildest propagandist orator, there must be countless unknown deputies and lesser troops involved in tedious preparation and or follow through. And of course, there are also countless propagandists whose assignments in no way entails the maddening of the multitudes. Ad makers, researchers, creative directors, copywriters, art directors, photographers, labor graduates towards mass reaction that in general are non-explosive and intermediate, but incrementally, individually dispersed, half conscious. As this book demonstrates, the public relations expert likewise seek to make a gradual impression. After long research and sober planning in the hearts of such methodology manipulations, there would seem to be no streak of mad commitment at their enterprise is not infuriating and millennial, but businesslike and mundane and rational. And yet those who do such work are also prone to lose touch with reality, for in their universe, the truth is ultimately what the client wants the world to think is true. Whatever cause they serve or goods they sell, effectively, propagandists must believe in it, or at least momentarily believe that they believe in it. Even he or she who propagates commodities must be, to some extent, a true believer. To advertise a product, you must believe in it. To convince, you must be convinced yourself, observes Marcel Rubinstein Blanchard, longtime head of Publicis, the giant French ad agencies. I guess I really believe all those certain things I say in those ads. It seems to have nothing to do with the hard-headed strategies I can work out for marketing products. Miss Shirley Polykoff, it's Polykoff, and Clairol's legendary ad woman. Does she or doesn't she? Only her hairdresser knows for sure. That must be an ad from this past. And even in the magistrate Bernays, we note that the tendency to let his clients' needs dictate the truth. Such is the major occupational hazard facing all full-time propagandists, even this most cautious and painstaking of professionals whose celebrated title, Counsel on Public Relations, imply not just a heightened status, but a certainly lawlorly impartiality. Bernays invented the authoritarian, that is, seeming sponsor committee as a way to hype his clients' wares. He first used this now venerable gimmick in early 1913, assembling a committee of physicians to approve the Broadway production of Eugene, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm going to say Bryce's B-R-I-E-U-X play, Damaged Goods, which dealt forthrightly with the issue of venereal disease. A few years later, he used that device again to sell the American people on the Harley breakfast, that is, of frying eggs served on strips of bacon, whereas the old type salesman would merely place a lot of ads distorting everyone to eat more bacon because it is good, because it gives you energy, etc. Bernays' approach, as ever, was more scientific. The newer salesmanship, understanding the group structure of society and the principle of mass psychology, would first ask, who is it that influences the eating habits of the public? The answer, obviously, is the physicians. The new salesman would then suggest to the physicians to say publicly that it is wholesome to eat bacon. He knows that a mathematician, certainly that large number of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he understands the psychological relationship of dependency of men upon their physicians. Wow. It still is today. People actually look to their doctors to actually solve their problems, physical problems, you see. So this has been going over for over 100 years already, with even this whole idea of even looking to a doctor is, what should I eat, or what should I basically what I eat, and how do I groom myself better, what type of drugs I might need to use in the future, you see, if I deal with certain issues. And that still goes on. In fact, that's been going on here in the last 2 or 3 years, if you notice that. The craziness has been going on, let's just say. This was all very well, and yet the impressive scientism of Bernays' way of selling bacon contradicts the inconvenient scientific fact that eating bacon has turned out to be not wholesome after all, with all its high fat content and supposedly cholesterol. Certainly, this risk was not yet clear to the American medical establishment when, in the mid-20s, Bernays pitched a hearty breakfast for the Beechnut Packaging Company. It is significant, however, that in his universe is the perennial conscious consensus that determines what is true. So he's looking at, he's looking at a consensus of people and actually begins to draw on this thing and actually gives the idea this is a good product, or this is, yeah, I'd like to have bacon, such and such. And before this time, actually, what I read is that people would actually, they would not make breakfast. They would just recook what they had the night before for dinner. They would have it still in the well, they didn't have a fridge back then, so they would just reheat what they had the night before. Leftovers, what we call it. This is not to fault him for relying on doctors of his day, nor to suggest that we would have tried to underplay the risks of fatty foods if it had known about them. Indeed, Bernays was, in this regard, exceptional ethical. Once the toxic side effects of smoking had become impossible to talk away, Bernays not only gave up working for tobacco companies, but became a vocal critic of tobacco, lobbying staunchly and unsuccessfully to get the Public Relations Society of America to enjoin its members not to work in any way to spread the habit. Bernays can only be applauded for his scrupulous position, which reflected his lifelong commitment to a stringent code of ethics for all PR specialists. But the issue here is not so much ethical or as epistemology. In a world under the influence of propaganda experts, how does a costly truth get out into the world as true? When is an idea no longer just a crackpot theory or a paranoid delusion of left or right, but something that must be and finally is accepted? Bernays' eventually stand on cigarettes was admirably indeed, especially considering his own prodigious work from the mid-30s for George Washington Hill American Tobacco Company. The propagandists helped Hill sell a lot of Lucky Strikes. That's the name of a cigarette brand at that time. The risks of smoking were, however, evident before the anti-smoking propaganda started picking up momentum in the 50s. As early as 1941, the independent journalist George Seldes, Seldes, was interrupted reporting on the perennial medical discoveries in his tiny, muckraking journal. In fact, with the exception of Reader's Digest, no other American news source, print or broadcast, dare even to hint at what tobacco scientists were finding out. And an advertising-induced blackout that persisted by and large until the 70s. Such was the clout of the tobacco companies, which used Bernays' sort of propaganda genes to keep most people blithely unaware of what they were inhaling. Although Bernays did see the light about tobacco then and did the honorable thing, the fact is that corporate propaganda squelches inconvenient journalism enterprises so that every warning failed to resonate and glowing ills received no mass attention. As with the risk of smoking, so it has been until very recently with global warming, and so it is today with the carcinogens, it's a hard word to say, of cell phones and the toxic side effects of fluoride, just to name a few underreported threats to public health. In all such cases, the investigator journalist is the propagandist's natural enemy, as the former serves the public interest, while the latter tends to work against it. Thus, Bernays expresses here a hostile view of muckraking journalists, which would always becloud the sunny view that he was hired to propagate. That is, view might be false or incomplete. It's a possibility that just does not come up in propaganda. Big business studies every move which may express its true personality. The author writes, implying clearly that the corporate personality is always somehow likable, attractive, and benign. A notion as unsound as any theorem or medieval superstition. Concerning cigarettes, the counter-propaganda finally overwhelmed the pro-tobacco propaganda that had long prevented any public talk about the actual effects of smoking. Other Bernays campaigns were likewise meant to preempt all discussion, if not all conception, of some rational alternative to the established way of doing business. In 1929, that is, for instance, Bernays mounted the Light Golden Jubilee. This grand occasion featured a much-hyped joint appearance of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, was ostensibly an earnest and spontaneous celebration of the 50th anniversary of Edison's invention of the light bulb. In fact, the Jubilee was but a stroke of propaganda on behalf of General Electric and its National Electric Light Association, which was a secret means of GE's stranglehold on American electric power from 1919 until 1934. The National Electric Light Association carried out the largest peacetime propaganda drive in U.S. history, intended to discourage public ownership of the utilities, that private capital should wield complete control over the nation's power supply was a notion evidently not to be debated. Similar, there is, in 1953, Bernays helped put across the myth that Guatemala was at risk of communist subversion, a cerebral legend that the propagandists actually believed, and he made clear in his memoirs. Bernays was then employed by United Fruit Company, which is actually today Chiquita, as whose behest the Eisenhower administration used the CIA to overthrow the Democratic elected governorship of Jacobo Arbenz, that's Arbenz. Thus was Guatemala forced to start its gruesome modern history as a quasi-fascist oligarchy. From that point on, the banana and pineapple would continue to be safely picked by inexpensive native labor under careful watch, with all the profits flowing north. The possibility of some other, less explosive non-colonial arrangement was clearly not to be imagined by Bernays, just as United Fruit could not imagine it, and so it never could become a public issue here. I take a break right here, drink some water. So eventually, United Fruits Company, the name was changed to Chiquita. Chiquita was because it had such a negative impact. And in reality, they actually standardized also the bananas. They were not. It's not what they call a yellow banana. There were other colors of banana, different types of bananas. But United Fruit was basically concerned about what I call pushing their product, and so they pushed one particular banana type. You see, and that's what they continue to do. And what happened in this situation in the 1950s was that the people got tired of it because they basically couldn't make ends meet. They were slaves, you see. And obviously, Bernays feels simply as you see, his particular approach here simply is that he continued to support them, and that meant simply eventually the United States was involved and overthrew a government. Okay, overthrew a government. Okay, but they wouldn't. They paid their people like slaves. Okay. As propaganda for its author's service, propaganda was no doubt successful, adding lusters to Bernays' reputation in the business world and thereby winning him new clients. As propaganda for reclaiming propaganda, on the other hand, this book did not succeed, nor could any book, or for that matter, any other sort of propaganda, possibly have made the controversial word uncontroversial again. By 1928, the word troubling connotation had not faded. On the contrary, throughout this decade, there had been a gradual, disoriented revelation of just how systematically and how ingenious the Allied government had fooled the people of two great democracies, that is, Great Britain and the United States. Once the thrill of victory had faded and the troops came home, if they did come home at all, disfigured or disabled, and the reasons for the war were now less clear than they had seemed, the sort of details of the propaganda drive against the Hun began to circulate, spread far and wide in the belated flood of memoirs, reminiscent, published diaries, after dinner speeches, and historical accounts. At first, the Allies' fatal trickery was reported and deplored only in such liberal journals as the New Republic. By mid-decade, the dispersing truth about the wartime propaganda was the subject of several highly damning exposés in the Saturday Evening Post. a riotous organ widely read. Throughout the press, propaganda was now commonly condemned, and for the most part, not as some dark alien force unloosed upon our virgin culture by the Prussians or Reds, but for far worse by propagandists of our own. Now it came to light at times the charges were hysterically exaggerated, that various U.S. interests had control to mislead the people into a gratuitous slaughter overseas. Pro-British economic interests like the House of Morgan, weapon manufacturers, and anti-leftist groups, as well as all those common hucksters drawn into the service of the government. From the 20s on up until the start of World War II, the word was even more pejorative, as it suggested not just lying, but betrayal. Thus, Bernays' position was eccentric in the public's eye when this book of his came out in 1928. That same year saw the publication of another very difficult book on propaganda, that is from Falsehood in Wartime by the British MP author Ponsonby, spelled Ponsonby. It's a straightforward catalog of all the major falsehoods propagated by the Allied governments. Ponsonby refutes each lie, explaining also how and why it was devised and spread. That book created quite a fury on its publication in both Britain and America. Bernays' cunning propaganda failed to resonate as strongly as this other bluntly book, which seemed the ultimate summarization of the case against the craft that Bernays tried throughout his life to justify. The propagandist was no loser at his game, however. True, the word remains simplistically pejorative and is so used today. Bernays' sanguine view of propaganda, furthermore, and the sophisticated he often used to make his arguments, put him on the weak side of debates in public, and earned him much contemptuous abuse from those applauded by the deceitfulness and tawdry aims of corporate propaganda. There were much more such critics in the 20s and 30s than there are today, and their critiques were publicly acceptable far more than they are today. Bernays' own priorities, however, such treatment was unlikely to have hurt him much. The audience that he most cared about, it seemed, was not the public, and surely not those intellectuals who so despised his craft. He wrote for those who understood the value of that craft and could afford to make it work for them, even as the people understandably destructive propaganda. More and more, propaganda was becoming even more pervasive as its sponsors marveled at its victories. In fact, Bernays notes in this book, its use is growing and the efficiency in gaining public support is recognized. That propaganda easily seduces even those whom it must horrify his paradox that Bernays grasps completely, and it is one that we must try at last to understand if we want to change the world that Edward Bernays, among others, made for us. This is from this is a preface here. That is the introduction was by Mark Crispin, Crispin Miller, from New York City, July of 2004. So this would not have been in the book here. Okay. Let's see. So that's the introduction. And let's see, I'm going to take a break here a little bit, just because my throat's a little dry. And it's actually been 48 minutes for this particular read, so may go into chapter 1. Let's see how long that thing's going to be tonight. Let's see how far you can get far here. This is a classic piece. Actually, not too long. I want to read this particular book. I like to read the other one by Walter Lippmann, who talks about public. What's the word? I'm trying to think of it. So basically, it's how they created public opinion by using political polls. That is, they took polls from people randomly, supposedly. That's another thing you need to ask yourself. But anyway, I like to read that book sometime. But this one's interesting simply because of that. So I'm going to take a break about 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll be back. Appreciate you all being here. Again, if you have any questions or something of nature, I thought there's a good rendition of this book by the guy, the preface here, introduction. I've been wanting to read this. I've read part of it a little bit, but I never got finished with it. This would be a good opportunity to finish it up. But thank you for being here, and I'll be back in probably about 10 minutes. Thank you.